Another scandal in British politics. This time, one of the country's most high-profile ministers has been fired. Nadhim Zahawi, a self-made millionaire who came to Britain from Iraq as a child refugee, seemed destined to rise to the very top of British politics. But Prime Minister Rishi Sunak sacked him over his irregular financial affairs and attempts to evade scrutiny. The whole thing was uncovered by a handful of journalists and a self-described tax nerd who smelt something rotten months ago.
The breaking news that we have had in the last few minutes, the Prime Minister has sacked Nadhim Zahawi.
After a long week stuffed full of negative headlines came the latest in a long line of government scandals. Nadhim Zahawi has been found to have breached the ministerial code 7 times, relating to his failure to disclose a settlement he made with HMRC, the UK's tax authorities. It wasn't the government, though, that first revealed his financial troubles, but journalists and a tax investigator called Dan Needle.
I think he will have received about £27 million and not paid tax on it. Until eventually he was forced to because it was being reported, didn't admit it, denied it, threatened to sue people and went to HMRC to quietly settle it.
As Needle points out, Zahawi initially denied being investigated.
I was clearly being smeared. I was being told that the Serious Fraud Office, that the National Crime Agency, that HMRC are looking into me. I'm not aware of this. I've always declared my taxes.
Then Zahawi tried to warn journalists off with threats of legal action.
When he knew there was something wrong with his tax affairs, sent lawyers after me and others trying to report on it.
Curiously, as the story grew, Zahawi retained the Prime Minister's backing.
Mr. Speaker, my honourable friend has already addressed this matter in full, and that's nothing more that I can add.
But the opposition wasn't having it and kept up the pressure.
I think it's obvious that Zahawi can't stay as Tory party chair. The very idea that he can be discussing and negotiating his own tax affairs with the body that he's supposed to be running. Everybody knows it's wrong. He clearly isn't going to resign, and so the Prime Minister needs to show some leadership. This is a test of the Prime Minister.
And the Prime Minister finally relented.
Since I commented on this matter last week, more information has come forward, and that is why I have asked the independent advisor to look into the matter. Now, I obviously can't prejudge the outcome of that, but it is right that we fully investigate this matter and establish all the facts.
Just a week later, the independent advisor, Sir Ray McCann, sent his findings to the Prime Minister, and they were devastating. Magnus wrote, "You have asked me to review the circumstances and facts concerning certain tax affairs of Nadhim Zahawi. My overall judgment is that Mr. Zahawi's conduct as minister has fallen below the high standards that, as Prime Minister, you rightly expect from those who serve in your government." Almost immediately, Rishi Sunak sacked one of his hitherto most trusted advisors.
When all these questions started coming to light about Nadhim Zahawi, I asked the independent advisor to get to the bottom of it and to provide me with the facts. And then on the basis of the facts, which he did relatively quickly over the course of last week, I was able to make a very quick decision that it was no longer appropriate for Nadhim Zahawi to continue in government, and that's why he's no longer there.
Well, Rishi Sunak there trying to put a lid on the Zahawi affair, but as our producer found out, most ordinary Brits are not inclined to just forget about it.
What do you make of Nadhim Zahawi and his tax affairs?
I find the whole lot totally rotten. It just shows exactly what this government are like. I cannot believe anybody can vote for them. But then, who knows what's in people's minds, eh?
It appears that he's been a bit naughty, and it would seem to me that what he should perhaps have done is taken himself out of it earlier. I'm not sure that necessarily he's done anything particularly wrong, but there's just a perception, isn't there?
And will you be voting for the Conservatives?
That's a different question. It wouldn't be related to Nadhim Zahawi particularly, but probably not.
After the positive view people had of him following the vaccination, which I did, he's really let himself down because he's actually put himself into the same group that we all think Conservative people are, that are not aware of the public, that are not aware of general people who are working hard to get their money, and he can have, millions of pounds that he's had to pay back. So that's a lot of money that he's mistakenly not paid. So it's shocking, yeah.
And will you be voting Conservative at the
No,
next
I
election?
definitely will not. I am a northerner. Where I was from, it's always been very Labour, but last time Conservatives did get in, and I don't think they'll be back.
I think it is abusive of him, abusive to the public. I think there are two things of major concern. One is that he obviously sought to avoid tax at the same time as he wanted to be in government, to be in control of tax. But in some ways even more important is the way in which he took legal action to attempt to stop journalists speaking about it.
Time to bring in our guest now, and Andre Walker is a Conservative political commentator and a member of the Conservative Party. We also have Ray McCann, who used to be a senior inspector at the HMRC. And finally, Ella Whelan is a journalist and writes for Spiked Online. Thanks to all three of you for coming to the Nexus today. Andre Walker, you're the only one on the panel who thinks that Nadhim Zahawi should still be in government. Why can you make that case? What's your point there?
Well, I think it's important to bear in mind that there are plenty of people who are in business who will have a private dispute with the HMRC. I think that's a legitimate thing. There's always going to be disagreements on the precise implications of the tax code. And I actually think that as long as there has been no criminal prosecution, no allegation of wrongdoing, no deliberate allegation of deliberate wrongdoing, then actually, this is a matter that is between an individual and the HMRC. I just worry when I see people in Parliament saying, oh, this is a party of millionaires, X person has done this, Y person has done that. What level of personal success should preclude you from being in public office? I can't believe this man has made £27 million. I'm incredibly jealous of it. But actually, when you live in that world, mistakes will happen. And as long as there's no allegation of fraud, I actually think that if it's settled privately, it should be a private matter.
Ella Whelan, Andre's in a very forgiving mood. You?
No, I think probably most people, whether or not they're jealous of Nadhim Zahawi having millions of pounds, can see that, on a very basic level, a government that is so obsessed with tax. I mean, all this government talks about is tax, whether it's raising it, lowering it, fighting about it, should be able to pay it properly. And if they're going to be so obsessed with it, whether or not there has been criminal, offences taken place, I think it just proves that the Conservative Party and their politicians, I mean, this goes for quite a few parties in Westminster, but particularly the Tories at the moment, are kind of not just out of touch with the rest of the nation, but also in the way in which they handle their out of touchness is it's grating. It's a similar thing happened with Rishi Sunak when he sort of got very upset about the fact that some people thought that maybe it was a problem that, him and his wife's finances and the way in which they handled it, the kind of indignance with which they approached criticism of, even things like him wearing sort of, Prada loafers or things like that. There's just a kind of, it's just the tone of it, I think, comes across to people as, shut up plebs. There's nothing to see here. I think that's a problem.
It sounds to me like Andre's saying that, Ray, that mistakes happen. It can happen to anyone. What's the problem? Perhaps you can explain, Ray.
Well, I think the problem is quite simple. And to go to Andre's point, I don't think anyone really would resent the fact that Mr. Zahawi made lots of money. The problem is Mr. Zahawi tried to pretend that he didn't make lots of money. And that's how he got into trouble with HMRC. We have to go at face value of what HMRC have said, and what Mr. Zahawi have said is that this has been treated as a careless error, and I can see a path as to how he gets there. But as I see it, there are three main aspects to this. There's the tax point, obviously. There's the question of his ethics, and then there's the question of politics. And the only area that I've really criticised him on, I mean, it'd be a bit hypocritical for me and other tax advisors to criticise him for getting his tax wrong, since, that's how we make a living, is helping taxpayers get out of trouble when they're in trouble with HMRC. But his ethics, it's when the allegations started swirling around him, he came out and he was threatening to sue various media outlets. He was threatening to sue Dan Needle, the tax lawyer, who was trying to ask questions and expose, his apparent wrongdoing. And I just think he handled it very, very badly. And he was completely out of touch. And I agree with what Ella said. For the last 10, 15 years, this government has done nothing but lecture taxpayers in terms of making sure that their tax is right, whether it's tax avoidance, tax evasion, and so on. And you simply can't have a situation where a senior member of the government is found to not be paying the right amount of tax. We all make mistakes. I'm sure other members of parliament have made mistakes in the past. It's how you handle that mistake.
You mentioned Dan Needle. He described himself as a tax nerd, but he's done a brilliant job as a tax nerd / journalist, hasn't he? Now, he's recently said that Zahawi said he had no interest in the offshore fund, but that he had discovered through some sort of corporate accounting quirk that, in fact, Zahawi had received £90,000. So that's just wrong, isn't it?
Well, it was just wrong at the time, and it deserved an explanation. And I think at the outset, Mr. Zahawi underestimated Dan Needle. I mean, Dan Needle is one of the most prominent tax lawyers in the UK. Up until now, he wasn't a household name, but he is now. But that doesn't belie the fact that he's an incredibly knowledgeable tax lawyer. And if someone like Dan comes to a conclusion that something's not right, people should pay attention. And I'm pretty sure that whilst Mr. Zahawi might have felt very bullish about trying to intimidate Dan, I suspect his lawyers were a little bit less confident when they wrote to him, because they would know that Dan wouldn't be overly impressed with the idea that lawyers.
Sorry, I think it is important to point out that Dan Needle, in addition to all the qualifications that have been laid out, all of which are accurate, is also a member, a campaigner and a supporter of the Labour Party. Now, I'm not saying that makes him biased, but I think that's important to note as part of this discussion.
Andre, he has declared that, to be fair, openly.
Hang on. I'm not suggesting any wrongdoing on his part, but I think the debate comes, in addition to the things that he's identified, which I assume to be accurate, because the man is more knowledgeable than me. I think it's important that when you are saying, does everything he's identified equal wrongdoing, he does have a bent in that direction, specifically that he's a supporter of a rival political party.
Yeah. I mean, obviously he's...
Well, personally, I think that whole point is irrelevant, Andre, if I'm honest. I mean, it's as relevant as pointing out that Mr. Zahawi is a senior Conservative politician. It's just one of those things. It doesn't detract from the rights and wrongs.
Allow me to answer that. No, I think it's important to answer that. Where it's important is this. Look, everything he's identified, I assume to be correct. However, where he says, I have now decided that as a result of this, that equates to wrongdoing, it's important to understand that he has a political affiliation when he makes that level of analysis.
Ray, let me ask you.
I don't question the rest.
Ray, let me ask you about what Nadhim Zahawi has said that HMRC have told him. They said that he had been careless and that it wasn't intentional. Even the word careless, though, according to Dan Needle, it just means that he didn't take the correct steps and could have done, given his immense resources, to file these tax returns correctly. So careless, is that, what should we read into that?
Well, careless, as explained by the head of HMRC last week, at the Parliamentary Accounts Committee, is a term that HMRC used to describe a certain behaviour. And basically what it boils down to is you don't take the reasonable care that a reasonable person would take. And in Mr. Zahawi's case, it probably is a case that he didn't take proper advice throughout the time where he was involved with the trust. And I think, to be fair to him, most people, Mr. Zahawi denied any connection with the trust, but the fact that you have no obvious connection to an offshore trust doesn't necessarily mean that for tax purposes that you aren't connected to it. And the various relationships that he had with his father and any agreements that he had with his father and the transfer of the YouGov shares originally in 2005, all of those it's possible that they gave him a connection to the trust, even though, from his perspective, he didn't think he was. And when the funds came in from the trust and from the company when YouGov was sold, it's entirely likely at that point that there was a sort of ticking time bomb waiting to go off if he didn't at that stage take advice to make sure that there was no possibility that he would be taxed in it. Now, again, one of the unknowns is, well, what advice did he take and who advised him? It may be that he did take advice at the time and he was given the incorrect advice.
Ray, forgive me, we've got to jump in there. We've got to broaden this out a little bit because the Zahawi affair is just one of a number of ministerial messes plaguing Sunak's cabinet. which is pretty astonishing given he's only been in the job for just over 3 months. You've heard of All the President's Men, the film about the Watergate scandal that brought down Richard Nixon. Well, this is All the Prime Minister's Men and Women. Nadhim Zahawi is in the political spotlight right now, but there's been controversy right from the beginning of Sunak's premiership. Barely a week into office, he reappointed the firebrand Suella Braverman as Home Secretary, despite her having to resign from the same position a week earlier after sending confidential government information from her personal email address. Sunak's predecessor, Liz Truss, told her to resign, one of the last acts before she herself left office. However, it's rumoured that Sunak couldn't keep her out of government because she was, after all, vital to him winning the leadership contest, and so she was back in high office, where she remains today.
The Home Secretary made an error of judgment, but she recognised that.
A few weeks later, Gavin Williamson, who Sunak appointed as Minister without portfolio, was in the spotlight himself. The former whip was accused of abusive behaviour towards civil servants and MPs. In particular, Liz Truss's chief whip, Helen Morton, who he claimed had excluded him from the Queen's funeral. When his nasty messages to her became public, Sir Gavin was allowed to fall on his sword.
Mr. Speaker, I obviously regret appointing someone who has had to resign in these circumstances.
Next up, another bullying scandal involving Sunak's number 2, Dominic Raab, the Justice Secretary. He's also accused of bullying civil servants, reportedly earning the nickname the Incinerator due to how fast he burns through staff. There are now reportedly at least 24 formal investigations into his behaviour. Despite that, Raab remains in his role without a suspension.
Because I take action when these things happen.
And finally, we have Rishi Sunak himself. It's believed he became the first Chancellor ever to be fined for breaking the law back in April last year, when he flouted the COVID rules.
I'm extremely and sincerely sorry for the hurt and the anger that this has caused so many people.
And now he's been fined again, this time for not wearing a seatbelt in this cringy video. Notice he is wearing a lapel mic.
Now, you can follow my progress as I go around the country today here online, or alternatively, go to the government's Levelling Up website where you can see an interactive map of everything that we're doing.
This makes Sunak only the second Prime Minister ever to have broken the law while in office. His predecessor, Boris Johnson, was the first. Pretty embarrassing for a man who promised to be a clean break from the Bojo era.
You were filmed earlier without a seatbelt on, Prime Minister, in your car. Would you address that for us?
Well, to be fair, the Prime Minister did address his failure to wear a seatbelt when quizzed by another journalist at a later date.
I regret not wearing a seatbelt. It was a mistake, and that's why I apologise straight away.
How can the public be reassured that you as Prime Minister respect the laws of the land which everyone has to follow?
Of course I do, and in this instance I made a mistake, which I regret deeply, and that's why I apologise straight away.
Well, that journalist mentioned public trust, and there's little doubt all these scandals have taken their toll on the Conservative government. An Ipsos Mori poll from a couple of days ago indicates that almost 2 in 3 Brits think it's time for change at the next general election. Just 10% of respondents say the government has done a good job and should have another term. 70% say the Conservatives have done a poor job in office. Let's bring our guests back in now. Andre and Ella, you're both journalists. I just want to talk about the defamation laws that were brought into play here. Nadhim Zahawi hoped that Dan Needle and others might shut up if he threatened to sue them for, well, basically what he called smearing him. Ella, as a journalist yourself, do you find that sort of remark chilling?
Yes, to put it sort of lightly. Definitely, libel laws in this country have a long history of being used by very powerful people to silence the less powerful. Now, a row between a minister and a lawyer might not light the fire underneath most people watching this discussion, but the reason why it's important is because rather than having a discussion in the public realm about, okay, we're talking about Nadhim Zahawi's private finances, but he's a public serving politician, and therefore the kind of that level of privacy that might be afforded to me or you or your average citizen doesn't necessarily apply, and that the information about this kind of stuff and debates about whether or not ministers are holding true to their line of being squeaky clean, which it's important to note that Rishi Sunak and Keir Starmer, but particularly Rishi Sunak, has tried to pose himself as the head boy in comparison with Boris Johnson, the Rishi Sunak, I play by the rules, and whether it's seatbelts, tax affairs, Dominic Raab allegedly sort of shouting at people, all of this, it looks to most people like a kind of party that's on the one hand sort of, you know, a bit kind of full of crooks, a bit sort of corrupt, a bit grubby, but also, I think more importantly, obsessed with trying to, obsessed with its own internal affairs. I think you know, the fact that Nadhim Zahawi responded like that shows how kind of narcissistic the Conservative Party has become, which just doesn't wash at a time of national crisis.
Andre, I know you think that Nadhim Zahawi is a big talent and all that, but surely it doesn't sit well with you that he was trying to tell journalists to shut up, otherwise he'd take legal action?
Yeah, so I think there's a great tendency in politics to think that everybody is kind of falls into one silo. You know, he can be both a great talent and somebody who's made mistakes. I genuinely think that he's made mistakes in terms of the tax arrangements. Look, is it possible that he believed that he was being defamed and took legal advice and then discovered he wasn't? Look, you know, I don't think that it's appropriate to attempt to bully journalists. But at the same time, when we talk about having one rule for one person and the same rule for other people, bear in mind that politicians ought to have the same access to law as anybody else. It is your right, if I defame you, to consult your lawyers and take legal action, and vice versa. I genuinely think that this government has made mistakes. I also genuinely think that Keir Starmer would be a terrible Prime Minister, as would be the Liberal Democrat leader, whoever that is this week, and indeed Plaid Cymru's SNP and all the rest of them. So I just think that things will have to change after the next general election, exactly as you said. But I genuinely think the Conservatives are the best placed people to do it, despite the mistakes, of which there are many.
I mean, if you look at the Independent Advisor's report, he said that Nadhim Zahawi broke the ministerial code some 7 times. How do you arrive at a...
I'll tell you. Yeah, I'll tell you what I'd do with the ministerial code: stick it in the shredder. What a load of old garbage. I mean, what should really happen is Parliament should investigate these breaches rather than coming up with some silly code written by a bunch of civil servants, investigated by a bunch of civil servants. The ministerial code sounds fantastic on paper to have rules for ministers. It's been nothing but a pain in the bum, a load of garbage. Let's consign it to the annals of history.
Ella, you're welcome to have a riposte.
Well, you know, I in a way, I think that the obsession with sort of naughty behaviour, which is what a lot of this amounts to, particularly the Raab stuff at the moment, you know, listening to the radio this morning, you hear people saying that there's investigations going on when Raab is accused of belittling behaviour, and you think, oh, grow up. You know, there is worse things that can happen to you than to be belittled by a short man like Dominic Raab. And, you know, I think there's a school playground atmosphere to a lot of what happens in Westminster that really turns people off from politics. But the reason why it's important to criticise politicians when they act like children and when they behave badly is because politics is a very, very important thing. And most people aren't interested in Westminster Games. They aren't, in as much as, they sort of roll their eyes about, big money people like Nadhim Zahawi not paying their taxes, whether or not he made a, mistake or anything. And most people are probably thinking, yeah. And I think that it's that kind of cynicism that is very damaging for those of us who want to make real political change rather than just watching this sort of pantomime play out in Westminster.
Andre, Ella's got a point, hasn't she? We're recording this on a day where we're seeing strikes up and down the country, perhaps the biggest in years. And what we see here is a distraction in some ways, but in other ways, I mean, you're seeing a government that can't possibly win the next election.
Well, this is an international audience. It broadcasts around the world. And I think the number one takeaway is Britain has become an independent country in the past recent times. And we've discovered that actually our politicians in Westminster are not capable of running a country. We were run previously by the European Union. We are now seeing a Labour Party that's dysfunctional, a Conservative Party that's dysfunctional, a Scottish government which is just a complete and total shambles. And genuinely, I think the international viewers of this programme are going to say, well, I don't know much about the tax affairs of one minister, but we do think that the British are failing to govern themselves properly. And I believe that's a function of independence from the European Union. These lot in Westminster have got away with being truly terrible for decades. And now Britain has to buck its ideas up. And I think we will do that, but I think that's a process.
Andre Walker, Ray McCann and Ella Whelan, thank you so much for joining us here on The Nexus. Much appreciated. And thank you at home and on your phones for watching. If you want to see this episode or any of our previous episodes, do go to our channel on YouTube. Just type in Nexus TRT World. Until next week then, goodbye.